When you work almost 2 decades in crime scene investigation, you learn that the truth is almost never lying in plain sight. It's hiding in the smallest details, in what people don't expect you to notice. And that night, I saw something that even many experts would have missed. It was supposed to be a simple call, a robbery gone wrong in an abandoned industrial park on the outskirts of the city. Victim, male, mid-30s, accountant, no criminal record. Suspect, unknown. Scene, a warehouse forgotten by time. Broken windows, rusted doors, dust thick enough to leave footprints. And that's exactly where everything began. When I arrived, the officers had already secured the perimeter. The victim's body was near the entrance, lying face down on the cracked concrete floor. A heavy iron bar, stained with blood, was discarded a few meters away. A violent fight, it seemed. No sign of robbery, though. The victim's wallet, phone, and even watch were untouched. At first glance, it felt like a personal crime. Something emotional, but something itched at the back of my mind. I squatted down, flashlight in hand, and started scanning the ground carefully. Footprints. There were dozens of them, messy, overlapping, chaotic. But as I traced the prints back carefully, I noticed something strange. 2 distinct types of shoe marks, but the pattern wasn't right. They weren't just from 2 different people. They were from 2 different sizes. That was my first red flag. Both sets led to and from the body, but they didn't behave like 2 individuals. It looked more like one person switching shoes mid-scene. I pointed it out to the rookie officer standing nearby, but he just looked confused. Who would stop to change shoes in the middle of a murder? He asked. Exactly. Who indeed? I kept walking the perimeter, mentally reconstructing the chaos. Then I found it, near a stack of broken pallets in the corner, half covered by a piece of torn tarp, a pair of sneakers, dusty, worn out, size different from the ones closer to the body, abandoned. I lifted them carefully with tweezers. Blood spatter on the sole. Fresh. Whoever owned these shoes was trying to leave a false trail. Back inside the warehouse, I looked again at the body. There were no defensive wounds on the victim's hands. No signs of a real struggle. And the blood patterns? Wrong again. Drops on the floor, sure, but not consistent with a full-on fight. It hit me. This was staged. Someone had arranged a scene to look like an impulsive crime, but the footprints gave them away. Switching shoes mid-crime to simulate a second person's presence. And it got even stranger. Security footage from a nearby gas station showed the victim's car pulling into the warehouse parking lot earlier that evening. Alone. But 30 minutes later, another figure walked in, wearing a hoodie and carrying a small duffel bag. Guess what? The duffel bag had 2 pairs of shoes visible on the footage. We ran DNA tests on the sneakers found at the scene. Sweat traces inside pointed straight to a co-worker of the victim. A man who, on paper, had an airtight alibi for the night of the crime. Only he didn't count on a tiny thing. The human body sweats even when you're calm. And sweat doesn't lie. During interrogation, he cracked, admitted everything. Envy, resentment over a promotion, a plan that he thought was brilliant. Switch shoes, fake a brawl, leave a chaotic mess for the cops. He almost got away with it. Almost. All it took to unravel the whole thing was a size 10 footprint stepping into a size 12 crime. Every time I walk into a crime scene now, I remind myself, never trust what's obvious. The killer may have planned for everything, but they always forget that real life is built on tiny invisible truths. And that's where we find them. Because in the end, crime is messy. And the details, they always speak. It was a hot Tuesday morning when I got the call. Homicide at a downtown hotel. To me, it sounded like just another routine case. However, experience had taught me that the more ordinary a scene looked, the more likely it was hiding something unexpected. I arrived at the 7th floor, where the atmosphere was chaotic. Police were taping off the area. Reporters were trying to sneak past the yellow lines, and the hotel manager, pale as a sheet, was struggling to explain what he had seen. The body of a middle-aged man. identified as Daniel Foster, lay next to the bed with a gunshot wound to the chest. Right away, I noticed something odd. The murder weapon was lying next to the victim, a silver revolver, seemingly untouched, without any signs of struggle. It looked like a clear case of homicide, or maybe even suicide. But that little inner voice, the one I've learned to always trust, was already whispering that something was wrong. First, I analyzed the body's position and the gun. The revolver was perfectly placed at the victim's right side, not thrown, not dropped, placed. Small details like that scream to those who know how to listen. I immediately called for ballistic tests. We collected the weapon and the bullet recovered from the body. Meanwhile, I kept combing through the room. On the nightstand, there were 2 glasses, one with lipstick marks, one clean. Daniel hadn't been alone. Stranger still, there was no sign of forced entry on the door. Whoever entered had either been invited or had access. The ballistics report arrived late in the afternoon. The bullet recovered was .45 caliber, but the revolver found was a .38, which meant only one thing. The gun at the scene wasn't the weapon that fired the fatal shot. From there, the narrative unraveled quickly. Whoever killed Daniel staged the scene, planning a random gun to confuse the investigation, and almost succeeded. We turned to the hotel security cameras. At first glance, the footage appeared to have been erased, but with help from our forensic tech team, we recovered parts of it. And there we saw her. At 3:18 a.m., a tall woman in a black dress slipped out of Daniel's room, wearing gloves. Now we had a suspect, but we were still missing the real gun. A meticulous search around the hotel followed. Hours later, they found in a trash bin on the lower floor a .45 pistol, carefully wrapped in newspaper. And fingerprints? None. She knew what she was doing. But she didn't count on the DNA left on the drinking glasses. A quick test gave us a match. Julia Kramer, someone known to have shady business ties with Daniel. The search for Julia lasted 4 days. When we found her, she was preparing to flee the state. Confronted with the evidence, the video, the DNA, the hidden gun, she cracked. But the motive still needed to be understood. During interrogation, Julia confessed that Daniel had been blackmailing her for months. That night, she pretended to make peace. She smuggled a gun into his room, waited for the right moment, pulled the trigger, and swapped guns to stage the scene. But her biggest mistake was thinking that something like a caliber mismatch would go unnoticed. In criminal investigations, it's always the invisible details that bring down the most carefully built lies. In the end, Julia was convicted of first-degree murder. And me? I was reminded once again that you should never trust the first impression of a crime scene. Because often, the truth is exactly where no one wants to look. I've seen a lot of strange things over the years, but nothing quite like the night the killer himself helped validate his own alibi. It started on a cold Thursday evening. I was called to a quiet suburban neighborhood where a respected local businessman, Arthur Millstone, had been found dead inside his home office. The cause? A single gunshot wound to the back of the head. Execution style. The kind of thing that screamed personal motive, not random crime. Arthur's wife, Elaine, was the one who found him. She claimed she was at a charity gala that night, along with dozens of witnesses, including security footage. It looked like an open-end shut case. An outsider must have broken in while she was away, or so it seemed. Then came Henry Boyd, Arthur's longtime friend and business partner. Calm, collected, and oddly helpful, Henry was the first to step forward. He said he had been with Arthur until 8 p.m., discussing some financial paperwork. He even produced text messages on his phone, showing Arthur confirming their meeting and saying goodbye. At first, nothing about Henry raised alarms. His alibi appeared airtight. Multiple people from a nearby restaurant swore they saw him dining there at 8:30 p.m. The timestamps lined up. Even the receipt from his dinner was there, tucked neatly into his wallet. But something didn't sit right with me. Arthur's body was cold by the time we arrived, but not that cold. Based on the early stages of rigor mortis and body temperature, I estimated the time of death closer to 7:45 p.m. That was before Henry supposedly left. Still, no clear evidence placed Henry at the scene after that time. I had to dig deeper. The breakthrough came from a tiny detail: the restaurant receipt. I noticed something odd. The ink on the timestamp was slightly smudged, almost like it had been reprinted recently. It was subtle, almost invisible to naked eye, but after years working crime scenes, these tiny things screamed at me. I requested surveillance footage from the restaurant. Sure enough, the cameras captured Henry entering at 8:30 p.m., but when I zoomed on the clock on the wall behind him, it was off by almost an hour. Someone had tampered with it. The footage had been edited live by adjusting the internal time settings. In reality, Henry was there much later than reported. I needed more. Something irrefutable. We pulled the text records directly from Arthur's phone. That's when everything blew wide open. The message timestamp showed Arthur had confirmed his meeting with Henry at 8:15 p.m., 30 minutes after he was already dead. But how could that be? Simple. Henry had Arthur's phone. He sent the text himself to create the illusion that Arthur was alive while he was at the restaurant. Then, after staging the crime scene and leaving with Arthur's phone, he headed to dinner, appearing calm and collected. Later, he abandoned the phone in a nearby park to make it look like random theft. It was brilliant. Risky, but brilliant. Henry's behavior during questioning became even more interesting. When confronted with the timeline inconsistencies, he was cool, almost rehearsed. He kept insisting the text proved Arthur was alive when he left. It was a psychological game. Henry believed if he was the one helping to prove the timeline, no one would suspect him. But when we presented the evidence, the corrected surveillance footage, the reanalyzed receipt, and the cell phone data, the cracks started to show. His confidence faded. His hands began to tremble slightly. His breath quickened, just enough to notice. Micro expressions of panic flickered across his face. To the untrained eye, he still looked composed. But to me, he was screaming guilt. In the end, it wasn't just science that broke him. It was psychology. We confronted him with one single, loaded question. Henry, if you were trying so hard to prove Arthur was alive after 8 p.m., how you explain sending a message from a dead man's phone? That was it. His entire posture crumbled. Minutes later, he asked for a lawyer. It's chilling when you think about it. The man who worked so hard to build his alibi, who tried to control every detail, ended up proving exactly what he was trying to hide. And it taught me something that stuck with me to this day. The more someone tries to control the story, the more likely they are to be hiding something. I'll never forget that case. It started as a typical break-in gone wrong. At least, that's what it looked like on paper. A jewelry store in the downtown area, reinforced with the latest in surveillance technology, had been hit overnight. When we arrived at the scene, the glass door was shattered inward, cases were smashed, and merchandise was missing. But what truly puzzled me wasn't the crime itself. It was what the security footage revealed, or better yet, what it didn't. When I reviewed the surveillance tapes, the first strange detail jumped out. There was clear footage of a masked figure exiting the store at exactly 3:14 a.m. Calm, composed, almost as if they had all the time in the world. They even stopped briefly to wipe the handle clean with their sleeve before disappearing into the night. But when we tried to trace the suspect's entry, there was nothing, no footage, no signs of forced entry at any other time. The cameras covered every angle, the front, the sides, even the rooftop entrance, and they were fully operational. Yet, somehow, there was no record of anyone going in. The alarm system hadn't been triggered either. How could someone exit a building they were never seen entering? The owner, Mr. Holloway, was in shock. He kept insisting he double-checked everything before locking up the night before. No doors left ajar. No staff inside. Still, procedures were procedures. We dusted for prints. Nothing usable, all clean surfaces. We reviewed external cameras from nearby businesses. Again, the masked figure was caught leaving, jogging casually down the alley, but not a single frame showed them arriving. It was as if the thief had materialized inside. At that point, I started considering what most people wouldn't: an inside job. When something defies logic at face value, usually someone is manipulating the narrative behind the scenes. I spent hours reconstructing the timeline, looking at door sensors, lock logs, system checks. And that's when I noticed something subtle. The backup power battery had been replaced 3 days prior. A technician named Cole Brighton had signed the work order. Routine maintenance. Nothing suspicious at first glance, except for one detail. Brighton wasn't on the regular maintenance staff. In fact, he didn't exist in the company's personnel files. I pulled security footage from the day the battery was replaced, and there he was, a man in a utility uniform, face partly obscured by a cap, moving confidently through restricted areas, working unsupervised. He had disabled a few minor alarms for testing, according to the logs. But what if he had done more? That night, I went back to the jewelry store with a forensic electronics specialist. We opened the main security panel and dug deeper, buried under layers of legitimate programming. We found it, a small, almost undetectable override script. It had created a timed 2-minute blackout window at 3:12 a.m. During that gap, all cameras stopped recording, but only inside the store. Externally, everything appeared normal. The masked figure had used that tiny window to slip in unnoticed, loot the valuables, and calmly walk out as if nothing had happened. It was genius in its simplicity and chilling in its precision. Tracking Cole Brighton wasn't easy. The ID he used was fake. But criminals always leave some trace. A tool left behind, a digital footprint, an overlooked detail. We found a partial fingerprint on a screwdriver abandoned near the backup battery housing. It matched a small-time cybercriminal with a history of breaking into corporate systems. Ethan Cole, recently paroled. When we arrested him, he barely reacted. No shouting, no denials, just a thin, tired smile. The smile of someone who thought he built the perfect crime and was quietly impressed that someone had found the thread he left hanging. He confessed later that he had been planning the heist for 6 months. Disguised as a maintenance worker, he had slipped malware into the system, timed everything perfectly, and used his blackout window to bypass all visible entry points. In the end, it wasn't the missing footage that caught him. It was the arrogance of believing he could erase every trace of his existence. And that's the thing about crime scenes. You can manipulate cameras, hack alarms, fake identities, but the smallest mistake, a fingerprint, a timestamp, a subtle inconsistency, is all it takes to unravel even the most carefully constructed illusion. I walked away from that case with a renewed sense of respect for the criminals who think 3 moves ahead, and an even stronger resolve to be the one who sees the 4th move coming. I was called early one Thursday morning. The report was simple. A man, approximately 50 years old, found dead in his home office. No signs of violence, no forced entry, no obvious wounds. Everything suggested a natural cause. But after 18 years walking through crime scenes, I knew that when everything seemed too simple, something was hidden. The victim was slumped in a large leather armchair, the kind that seemed to swallow you whole when you sat down. His posture was almost peaceful, his head slightly tilted to the side, eyes half closed. On a small wooden table beside him, a half-full whiskey glass rested quietly, not in his hand, but placed neatly next to him, almost as if someone had positioned it there. I examined the surroundings carefully. The room was spotless, impeccably organized. Thick curtains blocked the morning sun, and the faint smell of leather mixed with something sweeter. Something I couldn't immediately identify. The first sweep found nothing unusual. His cell phone was on the desk, unopened. The whiskey bottle was sealed and clean. The glass showed only his fingerprints, and the liquid inside had no traces of typical poisons. It seemed like a simple heart failure, until I caught a detail others overlooked. It was a small, blinking air freshener on the wall, almost blending into the decoration. I don't know why I focus on it. Maybe instinct, maybe experience. I asked the team to collect a sample of its contents immediately. Hours later, the lab called me. The substance inside the freshener wasn't air freshener at all. It was a rare neurotoxin, odorless and nearly undetectable, designed to disperse slowly into the air. The killer hadn't poisoned the drink. He hadn't contaminated food or injected anything. He had poisoned the air itself. The method was brilliant in its simplicity. While we wasted time checking the obvious, the glass, the bottle, the food, the victim inhaled his death with every breath. The challenge now was to trace the device. It had been modified inside, and the toxin used wasn't something you could find easily. Whoever did this had resources and time. The victim's circle of acquaintances revealed another surprise. 2 months earlier, he had fired a longtime employee after a major financial fraud was discovered. Quietly, without public scandal, the dismissed employee, furious but silent, had the skills needed, a background in chemistry and mechanical engineering. It took days of investigation, but we found surveillance footage from the building's parking lot. There, blurry but visible, was a former employee entering the building late at night, carrying a small box. He had installed the deadly device during one of his last visits under the pretense of picking up his remaining belongings. And he waited for the victim to spend hours in that office, slowly breathing an invisible killer. When we finally arrested him, the man showed no remorse. On the contrary, he smiled coldly when I confronted him with the evidence. He had built a perfect crime, one that relied not on brute force, but on patience, intelligence, and the certainty that no one would look where the real threat was. But in the end, even the most perfect crime leaves traces. You just need to know where to look.